happy to introduce Barry Romo. This is his, I think, 4th time for coming to Champaign and talking to Joe Miller and my class, and it's truly an honor to have him, and his stories for me get better every time I hear them, so you're in for a wonderful entertaining as well as educational lesson this evening. Barry Romo is the Administrative Vice President for the Mail Handlers Union in Chicago, as well as a regional coordinator for the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. He's been working for peace and justice for the past 30 years, and as far as I'm concerned, is truly one of the great heroes of the 20th century. So welcome, Barry Romo.
Well, that'll make me messed up. Before we start, I would appreciate it if we could do just one thing, and that's so I'll know you and you know me, and that is I'm going to ask everybody to tell me if you know a Vietnam vet, if your father or your uncle, your next door neighbor, a teacher in school, if you knew him, did he have any problems? Is everything okay? And so I'm going to want to go through everybody. People tell your names. But first I want you to all close your eyes. And I'm going to say the word Vietnam. And when I say the word, I want you to think of something. There's no right and there's no wrong. And I want you also to tell me what you thought of. So you can open your eyes and start with you.
My name is Megan, and I don't know any Vietnam vets other than Joe. And what I thought of was last week in my poli-sci class, we watched Hearts and Minds, and I thought of the scene where they have the people with the mass graves and they were crying, and then Westmoreland came on and said that they didn't value life as much as Americans.
That's a great scene.
I'm Jen, and I actually know Vietnam vets from both sides. I've taken Joe's class, and my friend Dang's father and his uncle both fought through Vietnam, and so I kind of have interesting stories from them. And for some weird reason, I was just thinking about Forrest Gump, the scene, because I saw it yesterday.
My name's Donovan. My father was in Vietnam. He was stationed in Japan. He was in communications. I haven't really talked to him about it much, so as far as what I pictured, it was just a lot of smoke and disaster with soldiers standing for tropical trees in the background.
My name's Andy. My dad's brother is a Vietnam vet. He also doesn't talk much about it. And I thought of the movie Apocalypse Now.
Hi, behind you.
Yeah, my name's Alex. I don't put my own bets, but I pretty much thought the same thing as he did. I thought of the scene with the pictures of napalm burning the road with trees.
I'm Amelia, and I just know Joe, and I just pictured a lot of documents.
My name's Hashim, and I don't know any Vietnam vets. I pictured platoon and just choppers and cars down there.
I'm Monica, and I know Joe too. And I just pictured Apocalypse and
My name's Imran. I don't really know any Vietnam vets except for Joe, so I pictured I pictured a woman carrying her dying child pretty much on the road.
My name is Ankit. I don't know anything typical movie.
My name's Brandon. I don't really know any vets, and I was just picturing that one TV show on TDX on the Saturdays.
It's all right.
My name's Andy. My uncle's Vietnam vet. As far as what I pictured, the first thing that came to mind was basically Forrest Gump.
My name's Evan. I know several Vietnam vets just through parents and such. I know Joe. I picture a lot of scenes from Hearts and Minds.
Hearts and minds will do it too.
I'm Julianne. I know Joe. I'm sure I know more, but I can't think of him right now. And actually, I thought of my mom because she actually used to protest the Vietnam War.
I'm Angie. I know a few vets. I know a few homeless vets. And when you said that, I pictured a jungle that has no beginning and no end, but it's like a maze.
I'm Amy. I don't know any vets except for Joe. A few others. I pictured just sort of a classic movie scene, like the embankment around the houses.
My name's Kathy. I just know Joe. I know my dad's cousin was in the war, but I never met him. And I just pictured that one really famous picture where there's this one Vietnamese guy who's about to be shot and he's like wincing.
My name's Bree, and my uncle is a Vietnam vet, and he doesn't talk about it at all, except for if he's really drunk. The first thing I thought of was that kid in Hearts and Minds that the baby that was burnt by the Vietnam.
I'm Nate. I don't really know anyone who's in the war. I thought about like all the, some of the disabled people and how much of a struggle that was for them.
My name's Sarah, and I don't know any Vietnam vets. Yeah, I was thinking about Apocalypse Now. I really picturing things.
My name's Kelly, and I have an old family friend of ours who fought in Vietnam, but we mostly hung out with him when I was a kid, so I don't remember if he told any stories about that. I just pictured one, but that's okay.
I'm Karen. I don't know any Vietnam vets. I pictured a lot of explosions and bodies. My name's Lisa, and I don't know any vets either, and I thought of Forrest Gump.
My name's Laura. One of my best friends from high school's father was in Vietnam, and I pictured my dad because he was telling me last weekend he thinks Nixon is the greatest president ever because he canceled the draft 2 days before my dad was supposed to go to basic training.
My name is Jordan, and I probably know some vets, but it doesn't really seem like the kind of thing that lots of people want to talk about. And unless it's a joke. But yeah, what was the other thing?
What'd you think of when I said Vietnam?
Jungle. I pictured jungle.
My name's Pat, and a lot of my dad's friends were Vietnam vets. And, I thought of some guy I work with, my dad's friend, who's an electrician every time. Talks about it, he's really pissed off. And they're always like, suffering from Agent Orange and they're denying it. It doesn't matter really. My name's Doyle, and I know Joe also, and I picture the famous picture of the Navy girl running on the
Info.
Specialist Nathan Picate, Army National Guard. My uncle was a Vietnam vet. I've only heard of him speak of it once ever. I know there's a lot of pain there for them. I pictured tracer rounds and the fear of knowing how many rounds are in between each one of those rounds and just the deep down fear that every one of you would feel.
The young lady, I'm sorry. Yeah. Right in front of, yeah. I'm just going back and forth this
Oh,
way.
I already went.
Oh, I'm sorry. I worked all night last night.
My name's Kristen, and I don't know any Vietnam vets, and I thought of Forrest Gump.
My name's Michelle. My dad was a Vietnam vet, and I don't think he had good experience with that because he went AWOL when he was supposed to go, but he eventually had to go anyway, so he talks about it though. He's like, but I just picture my dad being there whenever.
My name's AJ. I know quite a few because I wrote a research paper senior year, and I did 7 interviews with vets and a couple with protesters. And the first thing I thought of was the scene in Platoon at night around the patrol out in the bush. Kind of how stressful that was. Yeah, that was fun.
My name is Sadie, and my uncle was also in Vietnam, and I guess because I was thinking that for that second question, he had said the worst thing for him was seeing his best friend get killed right beside him, so that's the image I have in my mind.
My name's David. I know a I know a few vets, and they seem to be doing okay, but they don't talk about anything. And when I pictured Vietnam, I pictured a lot of jungle and some smoke.
I'm Carla. I know Joe. And Vietnam, I picture, I guess, My Lai and a lot of other vets.
I'm Randy, and my dad was stationed in the Philippines in Vietnam, and my uncle's a vet, and a couple of older cousins that are. And the thing that I pictured was there's this little paragraph from dispatches by Michael Earth about how tracer bullets against the night sky looked real pretty, and that always stuck with me because it was kind of ironic and haunting.
My name's Dan, and I know Joe. And I pictured when the Buddhist monk got himself on fire.
My name's Jim. My dad was stationed in the ASMP, and I just think about once letters that were in Bloods in high school.
In what?
Bloods.
Oh, in Bloods, yeah.
My name is Nuge. I don't know any vets except Joe. I was picturing just U.S. planes flying over, just dropping like tons of bombs, but doing like they don't get any kind of use out of them, just killing more people.
I'm Alan, and I also know Professor and I was thinking I should call the Magic Dragon.
My name's Matt. I know a couple veterans. One of my friends' dads, and actually one of my mom's cousins died over there. And basically, when I think of that, I just think of jungle warfare.
I'm Kurt. I know several vets, including my uncle, and I just was thinking of napalm canisters falling at people running.
My name's Jessica. I know Joe. I pictured the jungle and like extreme warfare, but I also pictured silence.
Silence.
My name is Sean, and I'm with Joe, and my picture was the little girl running down the street with my uniform.
My name is Miriam, and my dad's a Vietnam vet. He was, I don't know where he was stationed before the invasion of Cambodia, but he was in one of the bases that went in, and then he was stationed in Saigon after that, actually. And would that be right or no?
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay. And he doesn't talk about it a whole lot, but he says that the hardest part was coming home from the war. And when you said Vietnam, I pictured the pictures that you brought home.
I don't know too many vets. I know Joe and you. There are no vets in my immediate family, but a lot of my friends have fathers and mothers who fought in the war. My best friend, his father's on my farm. Came back from the war. I thought of a documentary I saw about a widow of an American vet who went back from Vietnam to find the place where her husband died, and along the way collected stories of widows on the other side.
My name is Mark. I have an uncle who was in Vietnam, and when you mentioned the word, I just thought it seemed pulmonologic.
My name is Todd. I only know Joe. The first thing I thought of was a police chief shooting a BC in public.
My name is Ian. I only know Joe. My impression of Vietnam is a country struggling to rebuild itself after the war.
I'm sorry.
My name is Dan. I don't know any vets. I guess the image I thought of was the jungle warfare, like guerrilla type warfare that I've read about in books.
My name's Sarah. My dad's a Vietnam vet. When you think of Vietnam, there's
I'm Jennifer, and I know her father and several friends of my family who are vets. And the thing I always think of is the black POW patches with the yellow print saying Vietnam veterans.
And it's amazing because today is everything on the news media is Columbine. And there was a terrible shooting there, and some children died. And it makes the news constantly with live programming. People that saw some of their friends die once on one day are made into national martyrs. And in Vietnam, 3 million Vietnamese died. in a war that lasted, that the U.S. fought 10 years. And day after day, children didn't see their friends die one day, but day after day. Vietnam, as my Vietnamese friends always say, is not a war, it's a place, it's a country. But the way we view Vietnam is through our eyes and through our sorrow. So we see 60,000 dead Americans, but we don't see 3 million dead Vietnamese, with another 2 million dead Cambodians and another 800,000 dead Laotians. Now I'm including missing in action and stuff when I say those numbers. 10% of all of the land of Vietnam was destroyed by 30,000 gallons of Agent Orange. When a little bit of Agent Orange is in a place called Love Canal, it makes national news. In Vietnam today, in some provinces, 29% of all pregnancies end in spontaneous abortion or gross birth defects. And I don't mean just small limps. I mean people, what's called cyclopsing, where the skull collapses on itself into one eye, brains born outside of the cavity, stomachs, hearts born outside of the body cavity. The last shot was in 1975, 25 years ago, and children are still being born with birth defects and dying because of a war we lost 25 years ago. I have my own views. If someone ever tells you that they're objective about Vietnam, they're lying to you. 2.7 million people served in Vietnam, and there are 2.7 million stories. I think mine are a little more common than most. And I didn't start talking about Vietnam 10 years ago or 5 years ago. I started talking when I got back. This will be the 30th year I've been talking. My stories don't change, although sometimes I remember things that I'd forgot before, even now. And so some of your teachers or friends here probably are going to be able to give my speech, because it's mostly the same thing every time. The group I belong to is called Vietnam Veterans Against the War, VVAW. Vietnam Veterans Against the War is the oldest Vietnam veterans organization. We were the first. The first time Vietnam vets got together as Vietnam vets, they didn't get together as pro-war people. They didn't get together because they wanted decent benefits or health care. They got together to end the war they fought in. More Vietnam vets joined Vietnam Veterans Against the War than joined other Vietnam veterans groups. 50,000 Vietnam veterans came back from the war in Vietnam, and while they were still teenagers, while the bombs were still dropping, while the guns were still going off, we stood up in the streets of America and demanded that the war ended. There wasn't another Vietnam veterans organization. Again, we started in 1967. There wasn't another Vietnam veterans organization until 1979, when a group named Vietnam Veterans of America was formed. And if you want to know who the guys were that formed it, I'll give you a little hint. Vietnam Vets Against the War's initials are VVAW. Vietnam Vets of America's initials are VVA. The newspaper of VVAW is called The Veteran. The newspaper of Vietnam Veterans of America is called the VVA Veteran. While the war was going on, there was no pro-war Vietnam vet demonstration. And it's important to understand that, because sometimes you'll hear revisionist theory that somehow when veterans came back from the war, they kept their mouths shut, they locked themselves in a closet, and they didn't talk about the war. When I joined the peace movement, I went down in the basement to this meeting Half the people there were young women. Half the people were young men. But half of those young men were Vietnam veterans. There was no VVAW then, but we were already a large part of the anti-war movement. We weren't separated off. We didn't forget who we were. We came back and said, the war's got to end. 2/3 of VVAW enlisted. 3/4 were combat vets. So normal percentages would be 10% of the people that fought in Vietnam were combat vets, infantrymen, special forces, Marines. And yet, overwhelming majority were combat. So we were combat, and we weren't pissed because we got drafted. We were pissed because we got lied to. We were pissed because of the things that they forced us to do. Wasn't always a left-wing radical, commie pinko, hated my government, hated Richard Nixon. We'll get to that. And if we don't, ask me in the question and answer. On my father's side of the family, I'm Mexican. My family goes back several hundred years in the Southwest and in California. Moved to California in 1834 when it was still part of Mexico. We greeted the Union Army, or not the Union, but the Anglo Army when it came from the United States to conquer Mexico. We were already there. We always joke about the drybacks coming to visit us. My grandparents didn't speak English, even though they'd been here all of that time. Never. My father's first language and his whole set of siblings was all Spanish. He didn't speak English till he went to school. And it was against the law. My father was born in 1899. And when he went to school, it was against the law to speak Spanish in the schoolyard. So he got beat by the teacher, and they forced him to wear dresses until he learned to speak English and stopped speaking Spanish. Strange situation where you would take a Spanish class and be able to speak in the course, but if you spoke out in the yard because that was your primary language, you would get beat. At the age of 10, my father started working in the fields. He was a lettuce picker, agricultural worker. Everybody in my family was agricultural workers until that time. His generation was the first generation to get out of the fields. He became a meat cutter in the 1920s. He joined the Meat Cutters Union. He was on strike during the Depressions. 6th grade education. Tried to make a life for himself. World War II came along, and he divorced his first wife, had 2 kids, my brother and a sister. My brother was already in the military. My brother's 27 years older than me. He was in the California National Guard, and then he was sent to Ranger training. My brother served in the Pacific and New Guinea and the Philippines as a soldier. My father got drafted at 44. Went through basic training and AIT, and when he was at Florida getting ready to go overseas, they changed the law and they said you didn't have to go overseas if you were over 35. My dad said, I'm already in the service. My father was also anti-Nazi. So at 44, my father went overseas to Europe, while his son, at 20, was fighting Japanese in the jungles of Asia. I always find that interesting because if you just watch Channel 11, well, it's 11 in Chicago, but if you just watch the program on the presidents, you'll see where poor Ronald Reagan couldn't make it to the Second World War. And they always talk about the fact that Ronald Reagan couldn't go because his eyesight was so bad. He wanted to, real bad. He didn't want to stay in Hollywood and make movies. He wanted to go fight. But then if you read his book, Where's the Rest of Me?, you discover that he was an enlisted man in the Iowa National Guard. And his eyesight was too bad for him to become an officer. But he hated being an enlisted man. So he memorized the eye chart. so he could become an officer. But he didn't memorize the eye chart enough so he could go to combat. All he had to do was learn one more line, and he could have been next to my dad in London and France. Sometimes you've got to think with the brain that someone gave you. Since I'm an atheist now, I won't say God, but there's something that someone gave you. And yet they never bring that up. It becomes a joke. That's lucky for me because my dad met my mom. My mom was first generation English. Her parents were from Ireland. They were planning to come to the United States in the 1890s. My great-grandfather actually died on the docks, and my great-grandmother was afraid to come to the U.S., so she took all that money and cashed it in and went to Liverpool instead. No, I'm not related to the Beatles. Every male in my mother's family served in the military. My grandfather was a 75% plus disabled vet from the First World War. He'd been an infantryman, and his lungs had been collapsed during a mustard gas attack, and he became a pacifist, an uneducated pacifist, but a pacifist. Refused to allow the family to cheer when bombers went over to Germany. All the women worked in defense plants. My mom worked in a defense plant. All the men, including my uncle, who was 16 at the time, went in the military. 2 of them died, one at Bridget Remagen, if you saw that movie, and another one in North Africa. They were all sort of left in the Labor Party. And lucky for me, my mother and father met and fell in love, and my dad lied to my mom about how old he was, because she didn't believe that anybody that fucking old could possibly be in the military. So he chopped 10 years off his age, and they got married. And my mom, like any good pioneer, got on a boat, came halfway around the world, from England to California, which is where I'm from and my family is from, and started a new life. I was born in 1947, because my dad said, shit, if I can fight a war at 44, I can have a kid at 48. My brother had a son 1 month after me, Bob. Was raised in an extremely strict Catholic household. I had the worst of both worlds, Mexican and Irish. The only thing was drinking. Drinking was the thing that united those families. I grew up in a black neighborhood. In the early 1950s, our neighborhood was blockbusted, and that was where realtors would come in. They would buy a house and give it or rent it very cheaply to an African-American family, and then would go door to door and give people 10 cents on the dollar to sell their home to get away from blacks. They would threaten and cajole, and my neighborhood went from an all-white neighborhood to almost all black. There was 3 white families left who refused to move. My parents said they didn't care the color of their neighbors. The only thing mattered was that they were good neighbors. It was irrelevant whether they were black. My Catholic church, St. Anthony's, was 1/3 black and 1/3 Mexican and 1/3 poor white, real poor white. And I went to Catholic school. My dad worked real hard to try to get me a decent education, and my mom wanted to make sure that I had a Catholic education. So they worked and they sacrificed, and I went to Catholic school, and I was raised in an incredible atmosphere of anti-communism and McCarthyism. And the Catholic Church and Pope Pius XII united at every level to, quote, stop the communists. And communism was seen not as homegrown, but an international conspiracy. Mao Zedong wasn't independent. He was a puppet. Ho Chi Minh wasn't independent. He was a puppet. Tito wasn't whoops, wait a second, we like Tito. Well, except for Tito, all the other communists were bad. And Tito was mostly bad. He's sort of like he had venial sins. He couldn't get to heaven. He'd go to purgatory. And we were raised to think in the context of this universal evil that was trying to devour the world. And I thought consciously that everything bad that happened came because of this international communist conspiracy. And I became a Republican. Here my father is, a founding member of his union on the West Coast. He's been on strike, a labor person, and I'm in the Republican Party. Well, I'm going to St. Thomas Aquinas All-Boys Catholic High School. I thought Goldwater had the answer. I read books, and we were forced to read books by a guy named Dr. Tom Dooley. Dr. Tom Dooley was a Navy officer, a doctor, who was in Indochina. And he was running around with the refugees and for some reason left the military and then became a Marino and stayed in that area and wrote 3 books, Fire from the Mountain, Deliver Us from Evil, and somebody will tell me, one of the older people later. And we had to read all the books. And in the books, Dr. Dooley, who we all looked upon as a saint, would talk about how the communists would go into a village and they would take all of the kids and they would pound chopsticks into their ears and they would say, "You'll never hear the Hail Mary again." Then they'd take the priest and they'd drag him out and they'd cut his tongue out. And they'd say, "You'll never teach the Our Father again." And so I was raised to see what was going on in Indochina as an ideological war and a religious war. They were attacking my fellow Catholics. I didn't know Vietnam was 90% Buddhist. The way they taught it, it was a majority Catholic. And as the war started to progress, and it started to go from a small action to a big action, I wanted to go fight there. I was president of the Junior Republicans in my senior year of high school. But I still wasn't a racist. I started working at the age of 16 on open housing, and I worked for the Rumford Fair Housing Act. And so there was this bizarre dichotomy where I hated people like George Wallace and loved people like Martin Luther King and thought all the bad stuff that was happening was by the commies. Only the confusion of a 16-year-old male on testosterone. I wrestled. It was only, it's real small, smaller than I am now, and without boots then. So I wrestled, I think, my sophomore year, 98, and then my junior year I wrestled 103, and then senior year the priest, after we'd raised $10,000, took the money and put it in the library when we'd get us wrestling mats. I should have known then. But I still wrestled AAU, I wrestled for the Y, and I actually went to college for a short period of time, majoring in wrestling. After I graduated from high school, I knew I was going to go in the military, so I got drunk and wrestled for a few months. And then me and 3 other friends enlisted on the buddy system. We enlisted because we wanted to go to Vietnam. We enlisted because we believed in Vietnam. I'm not mad today because the military treated me bad. I got every single thing I ever asked for in the military. Scary thought. I didn't want to go to Fort Polk for basic training. Fuck jungles. And Louisiana, strike 3. I went to Fort Bliss, Texas. I was from San Bernardino. Same temperature, sandy, liked it. Wanted to go to Fort Ord, so I was back close to home for advanced infantry training. I got sent there. Wanted to become an officer. Got sent to Fort Benning to become an infantry officer. Every unit I asked for in the military, I got. There isn't anything that I didn't get. That's not why I got mad. I joined the military and I thought it was going to be like the movies. I thought the military was going to be like what John Wayne and Randolph Scott and Desi Arnaz said in all those movies. I thought we were not going to have the problems with racism that we had in America as a whole, because I thought the only thing that would matter would be the uniform and the color of our blood. But when I got in the military, I discovered that the racism that existed in society is only amplified in the military. When I was in basic training, there was a Japanese or Asian American, 300 of us, tow-headed, all our hair cut off, trainees were sitting in bleachers. Drill instructor looked up in the crowd, saw that Asian vet or Asian GI, pointed him out to us and said, "See that gook? That's what you're going to be killing in Vietnam." It didn't matter to that rifle instructor that that gook was an American with an American uniform who might die for America in 3 months. The only thing that mattered was the color of his skin and the shape of his eyes. And it's understandable that the military would use racism because the military as an institution has to be able to take human beings who have been taught all of their lives not to kill and to kill. For 18 years, if I killed, I'd go to hell. For 18 years, I wasn't supposed to get in a fight. And now I'm supposed to go to war, not because my mom is being raped, but because the president has a policy. If we had a different president, we'd have had a different policy. So I'm not going and fighting because of a family feud, because I saw my family gunned down. I'm going because it's my responsibility, my duty. And so the Vietnamese weren't Vietnamese. They became gooks and slopes, slant eyes, and all those names I would have never have used in private or civilian life became a standard way of talking because the Vietnamese couldn't be human, because you couldn't kill them if you thought of them as human beings. Didn't change. We have members that served in the Persian Gulf. In the Persian Gulf, what'd they call them? Towel heads, camel jockeys, sand niggers. They can't be human. 18 years of training has to go down in 4 months so that you're ready to be an infantryman and kill for them. And the second thing they use is sexism, and that hasn't changed either, and that is the definition of you as a man and not being a pussy. I want you to run up that hill and down that hill 5 miles in 3 hours with a backpack on, and if you don't do it, you're a sissy, you're a pussy, you're a bitch, you're a girl, but you ain't a man. So they used the worst forms of sexism and male chauvinism to define you. In World War II, the average age was 24 years old. A guy named S.L.A. Marshall, a full-bird colonel, put together a number of people to develop after-action reports. And he developed methods of debriefing soldiers that I was still trained when I went to the infantry school 25 years later. And he discovered in the Second World War that only 24% of the infantrymen were able to aim their weapon and kill another human being. They didn't run away. They did fire, they pulled the trigger, but they couldn't aim. And one of the things that he surmised was the fact that when people were 24, they had already developed a personality. Many people had families. People saw people as human beings. And it wasn't different for those Marines on Iwo Jima or for those Rangers and infantrymen at Normandy. Race didn't even enter into it. They had the same numbers for people that were fighting Japan as those that were fighting against the Italians and the Germans. So race wasn't the reason. It was actually the development of personal character, maturity. So he wrote a book called Men Under Fire, and the military took it to heart. In World War II, the average age was 24. In Vietnam, the average age was 19. And in Vietnam, 99% of the infantrymen aimed their weapons and pulled the trigger. After I was in training for a while, I passed my initial enlisted training stuff, and I had to go before a board at the age of 18. And they said, well, you're kind of smart, so if you want to, you can go to officer candidate school. I was assigned to Fort Benning. My 19th birthday, July 24th, 1966, was the first day of infantry officer candidate school for me. For the next 6 months, I trained to become an infantry officer to serve in Vietnam. All of us knew we were going. And we ran around and we did silly things, and they trained us on all kinds of weapons. And I still wasn't a racist. But I was in Georgia. And while I was in Georgia, a guy named Lester Axe Handle Maddox, 1966, got elected governor. Now, Lester Maddox wasn't known as Axe Handle because he made axe handles. Lester Maddox and his kids owned some Greasy Spoon chicken restaurants, fried chicken restaurants. And if a black person, including a black person in the military, would come and attempt to buy a greasy chicken leg, him and his kids, his boys, would come out and beat them near to death with axe handles. And this is the person that gets elected governor while I'm going to officer candidate school with African Americans, one other Apache, Archuleta from New Mexico. And while I'm Mexican, I don't look it, so I could get off base. And all of a sudden, people who are getting ready to lead Americans in combat in Vietnam couldn't leave an American base. In 1966, 3 African American majors, field grade officers, Maryland National Guard, driving back from summer training, murdered northern Georgia by the police department for being uppity. The jury found the cops innocent because those 3 blacks in uniform that they killed were uppity. Black people were being asked to die for freedom and democracy abroad when they were getting killed here at home. When they asked for the vote or the right to sit at a counter at a restaurant or a Woolworths, when they asked to be treated like human beings here, contradictions started to show. I didn't know, still only 19, a lot more stupid than I thought. But the reality of the racism of America was becoming more apparent to me. I graduated, I was sent to Vietnam, and first I was sent to Fort Ord, California, where as a 19-year-old I was the officer in charge of a survival and escape and evasion course. We would train people to run through enemy soldiers. We would have people from another army unit that would act as aggressors. And the idea was, if we catch you, we'll kick the shit out of you, so what you got to do is learn to run and not get caught. One of the side things was training people what would happen to them if they got caught, and that they should only give their name, rank, and service number. But in reality, what it was getting people prepared for was what they should do if they captured a Vietnamese. Because what they were being told was this is what happens to POWs. I was the officer in charge for 4 months. I was then sent to Vietnam to a unit I'd asked to be sent to, the 196th Light Infantry Brigade. I was still real short. I'd grown 4 inches, so you know how short I was when I first joined the service. Put on 25 pounds. I was up to almost 5'7" and 147. I was 19 years old, and I was assigned as the 2nd platoon leader of Alpha Company, 2nd of the 1st. In I Corps, it was an area around Chulai, in an area south of the San Trabang River, where there was just an article about a Marine, not an American Marine, a Korean Marine unit that massacred hundreds of people. I was in that area when that happened. And then we went north to a place called Quezon Valley, which was around Tam Key. If people saw the Regret to Inform documentary, her husband was in my unit. That was the area that I served in. And it was an area that went from the Laotian border with a valley that slowly opened up onto the sea, went from triple canopy jungle to slight jungle, rice paddies, and by the time it reached the sea, it was all beach area, and that was the area we would go into operation against. In the movies, you see military actions, and it's almost like after they get attacked, they get a break. If you see the beginning of Hamburger Hill, all the guys get in combat, and the next thing you do is you see them all in a brothel talking about how bad it was. Actually, they're talking about how bad peace demonstrators are in the United States. I'll guarantee you that was nothing. We never talked about peace demonstrators when I got to a rear area. That was probably the least thing on our mind after we took casualties or got a chance to be out of the field. In reality, combat in Vietnam was search and destroy missions for infantry people, and that meant that you would get a backpack full of food for 3 or 4 days, and back then it was C rations or cans of food. You would have to carry multiple rounds of ammunition. You'd have to carry extra rounds. Every man carried 100 rounds of machine gun. You had to carry high explosives and white phosphorus hand grenades, smoke grenades, which were used to mark your place so that if airplanes or helicopter gunships came over, they would know you were American and not Viet Cong. You'd have to carry water, because if you were in triple canopy jungle, you didn't know where the ravines were. And so you would have a pack that weighed anywhere from 75 or 80 to 110 pounds. I was in combat once where we ran out of ammunition in a fight against the Viet Cong. We never ran out again. People that carried M79 grenade launchers carried 72 rounds. It was a whole case. I carried an M72. I carried a case myself. We also carried batteries for the radios. I upped my firepower, but that's another story. You'd get flown out to an area. You'd get off the helicopter and you'd hope that it wasn't a hot LZ. If you took fire, you'd fall down to begin with. You'd wait till you got all your people online, and then you would rush wherever the people were firing from, because you were the first slick and the rest of them are coming in after you, and you have to clear an area. If you took casualties, they'd be thrown on the helicopter and flown out. Otherwise, you would start your mission, which essentially was to be bait. Vietnam is a country with 2,200 years worth of history. They have ancestor worship, not that goes back hundreds of generations, but goes back a minimum of 7 generations, which means they know the area for a minimum of 7 generations. We're talking about a hectare of land in which they farmed, people that had never left small villages without electricity, without plumbing, small subsistence farmers. who knew every inch of the land. We were there for 1 year, 365 days. We knew it for that period of time. 90% of all combat was initiated by the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. U.S. Army statistics. Shouldn't surprise you. These are guerrillas, even the hardcore units hid in the jungle. That meant 90% of the time, they sprung ambushes on us. We were walking in their backyard. You're from Chicago. The Soviet Union lands, which doesn't exist anymore, but it shows you the prejudice I can't get out of my head. And so the Russians land. They're there for a year. You live there for 25 years. Who do you think's going to be ambushing who? Did the same. Their country. We'd get up in the morning, 5 o'clock, with light. Probably be 60 or 70 degrees, and that was cold. We'd make coffee or hot cocoa. A lot of times we'd use C4, which was really expensive, but it would make your water hot in about 3 seconds. And time was real important because we had all kinds of things to do. So we didn't use little burning heat tablets. We used C4 to do most of our cooking. Eat some ham and eggs in a can. The most important thing in the jungle was a bottle of hot sauce, some mustard and ketchup. Put your backpack on, get in a single file. You move out, you're not too close. You aren't wearing sunglasses because you're in Charlie's territory. Wear sunglasses, you might not see that string across the road. You don't talk because you don't want them to know you're coming. And besides that, if you're talking, you're not paying attention. You don't listen to radios like you see in a movie, because then you wouldn't be paying attention, and then you'd step on a mine. 1/3 of all the casualties in Vietnam were from mines. 500 Americans lost both arms and legs and lived. Talking about 19 and 20-year-old young men, most of them probably virgins, no arms, no legs, no life, and they lived. You smoked cigarettes, you drank hot coffee, the temperature would go up to 120 degrees. It would be noon and you'd stop and you'd cook some food. You'd set up in a perimeter and you'd look around and you'd talk. You'd figure out what's going on, and then you'd keep on walking because you had to walk where the big guys told you to go, because if you didn't, they might bomb you. So they could tell me, we think there's 700 guys over there. We want you to fight. Now, I got 40 men in my platoon. What are they doing sending 40 men against 800 guys? They want those 800 guys to attack me, so that when we attack me, I become the bait. They can bring in other infantry units, bring in artillery, bring in heavy weapons, and while they're attacking me, we can attack them and use firepower. So our lives became tickets for the captain to make major, and the major to make colonel, and the colonel to make general, and the general to run for governor of South Carolina when he got back Westmoreland. Then it'd be 120 degrees. It'd form back up into a file formation. Not too close. Not too far. And you didn't talk. You walked. And you walked. And you walked. And you waited. Because 90% of the time the Viet Cong shot you first. And you waited. And then as it got to be night, you would stop, People would eat meals. And then as it got dusk, we would break into ambush patrols. If I had 24 men underneath me, and I had anywhere from 18 men to 45 men underneath me as a teenage lieutenant. The disparaging thing has to do with how many casualties we took. And if I had 18 men, they expected me to do the same thing as if I had 40. We'd break up into ambush. If I had 24 men, I would have 3 ambush positions, and we would go out and sit next to a village, go out, sit next to a water crossing, go out and sit next to some place where we thought the Viet Cong might be moving. And I've heard people talk about the fact that we fought with one hand tied behind our back. They must have been a barber in Saigon. I was not in a Special Forces unit. I was not in the Marines. I was in just a straight leg infantry outfit. And we were allowed to kill anybody that was outside of their home or their village from 6 o'clock at night to 6 o'clock in the morning. And anybody that died was a Viet Cong. Anybody that ran from us and didn't stop, we could kill. I was always in a free fire zone. And that meant free fire. You know how you got an extra R&R in Vietnam? By how many people you killed. Everything became body count. It wasn't the media that forced the generals to do it. Westmoreland wanted to figure out how he could explain to America that we were winning. And so he came up with the idea that we would post our scores. And so if I took 3 men killed in my unit, they expected me to kill 30 Viet Cong or North Vietnamese. And the way they encouraged people was to give the person that killed the most people in the battalion a free 3-day in-country R&R. That meant if you killed 3 people, I killed 2, you got out of the field. We got to go someplace and drink and smoke dope and listen to music and not stay up all night, sleep all night. Because when you're on ambush, you stay awake 2 hours, you sleep 2 hours, stay awake 2 hours, you sleep 2 hours. 50% of the people on watch at all times. And you're in Viet Cong territory. If you want to smoke, you have to dig a hole, pull your poncho on top of you, and smoke the cigarette underground. Because if you smoke it out in the open, the Viet Cong are just going to look for that. They're going to see the burning edge of your cigarette, and you're going to die. If you captured 30 people with guns, in uniform, and you killed 5 people, only had 2 weapons, 1 was in uniform, you would get the pass, you would stay in the jungle. How long does it take someone to know that in order to stay alive, it's better to kill and get the hell out of the field? Americans were turned into gunslingers. Body count became the way to say whether we won. Anyone who was dead, whether they were a 7-year-old kid or a 70-year-old woman, was Viet Cong, whether they had a gun or not. All that mattered was whether they died or not. My nephew was drafted 1 year after me. My nephew was drafted because of a program called Project 100,000. Project 100,000 was a program that Senator Moynihan, who was then an undersecretary in the Johnson administration, and Westmoreland and Johnson came up with. And what they did was they drafted 100,000 kids a year, males a year, who could not pass the mental or the physical exams. My nephew flunked, even though he's 1 month younger than me, flunked twice, and they still took him in the military anyway. There's something to remember about Vietnam. I don't have can't write it, so you got to think about it. Don't go to sleep. During the course of the Vietnam War, there were 16 million young men eligible for the draft. 16 million was the number of people eligible for military service, males. Didn't draft females. The military needed, for every branch of the service and every theater. In other words, the military needed 6 million young men for Germany, Guantanamo Bay, Korea, Vietnam, Saudi Arabia. 6 million young men for all of the military. Of that 6 million, they needed 2.7 for Vietnam, or 1/2. Now, why in the hell would you have to draft 100,000 guys a year who couldn't speak English, who couldn't read and write, when you had 16 million as a base pool and you only needed 6 million? Seems to me you got an extra 10 million. You don't have to worry. It wasn't the Second World War. They weren't drafting 44-year-old men. The reason was if ever there was a war that was a poor man's fight, it was Vietnam. If you had any clout, you didn't go. Rush Limbaugh. You remember him. He's the guy who picked himself up by his bootstraps on radio, right? When he was 16, his father bought him a radio station. Missouri Republican, right wing, couldn't go to Vietnam or even into the military because he had a medical deferment. Pimple on his butt. Honest to God truth. Rush Limbaugh couldn't go. 3 Daily boys, my age, not one of them went. Gary Wills, or George Will, my age, couldn't go. Right wing. Why didn't he go? 2 congressional sons went to Vietnam. One was Al Gore. If you had money, if you had clout, you didn't go. If you were poor, if you were Mexican, if you were Indian, if you were black, you went. Bennett can write about morality. William Bennett, conservative Republican, my age, didn't go in the military, didn't go to Vietnam. If you had any clout, you didn't go. And so people like my nephew were drafted so that people like George W. could go into the National Guard. He was drafted so Rush Limbaugh didn't have to go. He was drafted so a whole group of right-wing assholes who are today want to reevaluate what the peace movement was about, what the movement for civil rights was about, what the movement for women's rights was all about, as if he has a place of moral authority over anyone. They didn't have the political or the physical courage to go in the military or go in Vietnam when they had the chance to serve. I'd have loved to have him in my platoon. Limbaugh never had to sit on that butt with that pimple. My nephew got drafted, got sent to Vietnam in the post-Tet offensive in '68 at Dong Ha. He was shot in the throat and he drowned in his own blood. I brought his body back. I had 8 months left in the service. I was 20 years old. I was made a company commander of A-22 at Fort Ord, California, which was an advanced infantry training company. And I sent 300 men every 9 weeks to Vietnam. 99% of them went there. I lost my faith in Vietnam. Catholicism was important to me. I even taught CCD, which is Confraternity of Christian Doctrine for you Protestants. When I was at Fort Ord, I taught all the officers' kids. I was still 20. But one day I went into the chapel. They had a great big military chapel on base. Had a great big stained glass window. And window was of Christ the Good Shepherd, Christ finding the lost sheep or whatever. And I kept looking at Christ, kept thinking about the people I'd killed in Vietnam. I killed 6 people. I kept thinking about the number of people underneath me that had died or been crippled, or I didn't have the slightest idea what happened to them. I kept thinking about people in my unit who would come to me as a company commander and say, Lieutenant Romo, I think I'm a pacifist. I don't want to go kill in Vietnam. And I had to say, you know what, if you're Catholic, the Pope says it's all right to kill commies. You had chaplains in the service whose job it was to confirm that Catholics had to kill. And I kept looking at this priest putting on the vestments, camouflage vestments. The media always thinks that's funny when they show priests putting on vestments in the field. Oh, look, that's so military. It disgusted me. I walked out of the church for the first time in my life. I missed Mass. I went back to the bachelor officers' quarters. I vomited violently. And I've been an atheist ever since. When I came back, I was so confused and so fucked up that I tried to use every drug known to man to forget what I'd seen. I always tell people, if someone would have told me that horse shit would have got me high, I would have spent all my time out in pasture, putting it up my nose. Didn't do heroin, didn't do morphine, did every other thing. Didn't have to do speed, but I took it anyway because I was awake 23 hours a day. My adrenaline never stopped running from Vietnam. People would talk about the war. They didn't spit on me. They did the worst thing they could have done. They asked me questions. The peace movement saved my life. During the course of Vietnam, 60,000 Americans died in combat. Since returning home from Vietnam, 130,000 Vietnam vets have taken their own lives. That does not include alcohol. That does not include drugs. That does not include single car accidents. Straight up suicides. Twice the number of guys took their own lives as were killed in combat. And that number may be as small as only 1/10 of what it should be, because there was a study done in Mississippi that found in Mississippi the sheriffs, when a guy would kill himself, would lie and say it was an accident, not because they were bad or evil, but because they were afraid that the family would be ashamed, because he couldn't be buried in the church, because they might not get insurance. So we can be looking at a much, much higher number of dead than I'm talking about, but at least we know 130,000. They didn't kill themselves because some hippie girl with long hair and no bra met them at the San Francisco airport and spit on them. I only wish my life was so easy that the worst thing that happened to me was that someone spit on me. I killed 6 people in Vietnam. Got a medal for saving 8 people's lives. When I go to sleep at night, I don't see the faces of the 8 guys' lives I've saved. I see the faces of the 6 men that I killed. Loved rock and roll, loved drugs. After 4 years of Catholic, all-boys Catholic high school, 3 years of all-boys army, 1 year of jungle, people ask me, didn't you hate the hippies and the peace movement? Fuck no! I couldn't wait to grow my hair long. Free love, free sex, no AIDS. My God, it's heaven. I went to a small junior college, and the peace movement wouldn't leave me alone. I went to join the Veterans of Foreign Wars, the Knights of Columbus chapter, that was connected to St. Anthony's Church because they had a swimming pool. And when I got there, the guy said my hair was too long. I'd only been out of the service 4 months as a company commander. My hair was shorter than my mustache. And my mustache, because I was 21, was rather sparse. I used to use mascara to make it look like it would show more, because otherwise I was too embarrassed. And my hair was too long. People would ask questions like, Barry, we shouldn't be in Vietnam. And I'd say, we'd have to be, because there'll be a bloodbath if we're not there. And they'd say, but Barry, were you ever around a B-52 strike? Yeah. Was that a bloodbath? Yeah. All of those silly things they were telling civilians and that I'd believed before I went to Vietnam came crashing down, not because I read a book, not because the Rolling Stones wrote A Street Fighting Man, not because the Beatles liked the Maharaji. It was because of my actual experience in Vietnam and in the military. I didn't change because people spit at me or called me a baby killer. I changed because they engaged me in conversation that touched my heart. And if they hadn't have done it, I'd have killed myself like that other 130,000 people, and there is no doubt in my mind. The movement became a way not only of doing justice and doing the right thing, it became a psychological crutch for me to make up for the things that I'd done wrong. And although I don't believe in God, I believe in blood debt. I believe that when you do something bad, you have to do something good to make up for it. And not because you're going to go to heaven, but because it's the right thing to do. I joined the peace movement. I was engaged in Panther support work. I worked with La Raza Unida Party, which was a Mexican-American political organization. I worked organizing GIs. We did counseling so that we could help get them out of the military. I worked with the Black Panther Party. We used to get in our car with a Black Panther film, and we still had our military IDs because I was an officer and there was a lot of us who were officers. And they make you keep a reserve commission thing until you're about 53, I think, although mine got stolen before then. And we would have Panther films, and we'd go to the military base, and we'd jump out with a long cord, and someone would stick it into one of the enlisted man's things, and we'd start showing a Panther picture about Free Huey Newton on the side of a building. And then people would call us up on the phone and say, get the fuck out, the air police are coming, because there's all Air Force bases around me. Norton Air Force Base, March, a whole bunch of other ones. And we'd run around to another side of the place and work with some more doing the same thing. We had a good time. Joined the Civil Rights Movement, began working with other organizations as well. Ran into Vietnam Veterans Against the War. Vietnam Veterans Against the War was the first group to bring up the question of post-traumatic delayed stress, a psychological problem that's in Vietnam vets for the service that they served with, but not just Vietnam. People have it from Persian Gulf War. One of our members is the first Marine to get disability for PTSD from the Persian Gulf. When we first brought it up, the American Legion, VFW, said we were sissies, said they didn't have any problems after the Second World War, and that was a real war. 1979, that supposed thing that didn't exist was declared service-connected disability under the Carter administration. 1971, we started bringing up the question of Agent Orange. Everybody from Richard Nixon to everyone else said that we were pushing communist propaganda. The United States wasn't using chemical weapons in Vietnam. Agent Orange couldn't hurt you at all. By 1978, we knew that Vietnam vets were dying. We worked with Maud DeVictor, the black VA worker in Chicago, who first broke the story of Agent Orange, not as a nurse, not as a doctor, not as a scientist, as a clerk. She was one of those clerks that you would go see to get disability. And a guy that was dying walked in and said, I worked with Agent Orange in Vietnam, and I think it's killing me. And this woman is a hero, not because she fought the government. She found the government's own books and manuals and did her job and got the first guy disability for Agent Orange. By mid-80s, finally the government admitted it. 1970, we brought up delayed stress and it wasn't real. 1971, we brought up Agent Orange and the government said it wasn't real. Always prematurely knowing what the truth is. And yeah, we brought up the question of Persian Gulf syndrome before we even went to war because we knew what they were doing to them. Depleted uranium rounds in close areas, forced anthrax shots so that they were actually poisoning the troops, our own troops, and the dangers of diseases that exist in flies and fleas in the desert that Anglos or non-Arabs can't deal with. The whole British Army went up 50 years ago, or no, 70 years ago, because of fleas and the diseases that they got from them, not from bullets from guerrillas. 1972, organized at the Democratic and Republican conventions. At the Democratic convention, we worked with, or I served on an executive committee with Reverend Ralph Abernathy, the guy who succeeded Martin Luther King, a woman named Beulah Sanders, and a lot of other people. And at the Democratic convention, we demanded that there be electoral change and that there be representation for people not based upon money, but based upon vote, and we won it. It changed 4 years later. That's not surprising. But there was actually an effect on the Democratic Party. During the course of that, 8 Vietnam Veterans of Vietnam Veterans Against the War got arrested under a thing by Richard Nixon. And they were accused of planning to go to the Republican convention. These were men that had altogether something like 27 Purple Hearts, 3 Silver Stars, 12 Bronze Stars, and assorted other medals. But they were supposedly going to go to the Republican convention and attack police stations with slingshots. Now they had to say slingshots because there had to be an overt act. And one guy in Tallahassee sent away 4 slingshots, so that became the weapons that were going to be used to attack the police stations to disrupt the Republican convention. Well, it sounds absurd, but you know what happened? Those Vietnam vets went to jail and prison. And VVAW had to put half of its energy for a year and a half in defending people against those charges. And while the government was able to spend unlimited amount of funds to convict those people and then turn VVAW into a terrorist organization, they were found innocent on the first vote, and the jury included a lieutenant commander in active duty in the Navy, which shows you how bogus the charges were. But for 18 months, we had people in prison. For 18 months, we had to raise $1 million from people who were so poor we couldn't get out of the draft a few months ago. It meant that we weren't able to exercise our rights politically because the government came down on us for exercising those rights. And in all of their files, and in my file when I eventually got it back from the FBI, every government security agency held the fact against us that we'd been in Vietnam. Their reviews of us said, knows how to make bombs, knows how to use weapons. They actually used our training against us. 1972, I went to North Vietnam along with a guy named Telford Taylor, who was the chief prosecutor at Nuremberg, and Joan Baez and a Reverend Michael Allen. And the war was supposed to be over because Richard Nixon in October had said, peace is at hand, stop the bombing. And we were taking packages for 550 POWs. We got there, and after 2 days, Richard Nixon started a secret bombing. And like the Japanese in the Second World War, who were negotiating, stopped the negotiation, and then made a sneak attack. At that time, the United States had approximately 200 flying B-52s. The United States used 150 of those B-52s against North Vietnam. For 10 days, they dropped more bombs than has ever been dropped before or since. First off, in perspective, in that 10 days, they dropped more bombs on just Hanoi, where I was, by 1/3 than the total tonnage dropped during the entire Gulf War. During the course of the Vietnam War, the United States dropped more bombs, fired more artillery rounds than every single side in the Second World War. More bombs, more artillery rounds than the Germans, the Japanese, and everybody else. While I was in Hanoi, they dropped the equivalent of 1.25 to 1.5 atomic bombs every single day. I saw Rolling Thunder in the south. I saw B-52s. We could never be closer than 2.5 or 3 miles because of a variation. There is no way to have pinpoint B-52 bombing. Then, I don't know about now. Day in and day out, we would wander the streets, first escorted and then unescorted, and watch people one day be alive and the next day be dead. When we came into the city the first day, we had to pull off the road next to a railroad yard, and it was right next to a small village. The railroad yard was totally and completely destroyed, and on the other side of the fence was a small village with a little grammar school or preschool. They saw we were Americans because we were wearing Levi's and I had a beard, and my hair was full then. And Joan Baez had a guitar case. So they came out and did a little welcoming thing for us. And the children had little ear flaps and bunny hats and all these things. And they said something in Vietnamese that I don't have the slightest idea what they said. And they did a little sing-song thing where they grabbed their arms and smiled and, obviously we love you and we hug you and all of this. And they were having a great time and we were having a great time and everything was wonderful. And Telford Taylor, who had also been the #2 guy at the ultra secret as a colonel, said, Barry, pinpoint bombing. Destroyed the railroad yard. Right here, we're looking at the kids in the school. Nobody was hurt. The second or third time we tried to leave Hanoi because we kept trying to go, but the bombing was so intense that the airport at Ifong never opened up. We drove by that area. And that small village with all of those women and children, all of those babies that had come out to us just 5 or 7 days before, were all dead. There was nothing military in the area. It was straight up terror, bombing, and nothing more. The U.S. was so callous, it bombed the POW compounds. And they were known and on every map. In fact, they have names. Hanoi Hilton is one famous that they knew of, but they had other names. Like the one I went to was called the Zoo. because that was the one where you met people. They were on display. Everyone had a name, everyone was known, and the bombing was so varied that Americans were bombing Americans. A minimum of 30 B-52s were shot down. One of the Vietnamese said to me, you know, General Curtis LeMay says we should bomb Vietnam until it bomb it back into the Stone Age. And the Vietnamese said, I think we'll shoot down planes until we're in the aluminum age. They were a brave people that had fought thousands of years, and they weren't intimidated any more than the British were, or really even the Germans. That kind of strategic bombing only kills civilians in an attempt to intimidate a population. After we were there for a certain period of time, one thing I got to say about the Vietnamese is they drink every bit as much as Irish and Mexicans, so I really was in heaven. I think that there's this new thing, we've got to all be from Ireland or all be from Hanoi, because we all drink alike. Party when you're sad, party at funerals, party at weddings. And although they didn't have very much food, they always had a tremendous amount of alcohol. They had rice whiskeys, and they had 10% beer, and they had orange liqueurs. And they would line all this shit up in front of you, and then you would start toasting each other. And really, you need something more substantial than rice and small amounts of meats and that inside of you. But we survived somehow. And one of the times when we almost had to leave, or we thought we were going to leave, the Vietnamese, I'm going to stop real soon and let you ask questions. But I want to make sure I tell this story. And that is, they had actually gone and found an orange and an egg and some sugar. And Vietnam was so poor and so backward, this was things that nobody had, and they made from scratch a cake for us Americans, who are going to be going back to the biggest land of the cake in the world. And yet, to them, they took what little they had and they made this, and we were really happy and surprised and embarrassed by their generosity. And we started to drink, and I'm looking at this cake, and I'm starting to think about the people I killed in South Vietnam and about my men. I'm starting to think about my nephew. I'm starting to think about what the United States is doing to the Vietnamese, and I broke down and I just started crying. And the Vietnamese came over and they surrounded me, and they took me away from the other Americans. And like a bunch of mother hens around an injured chick, they patted me and talked to me and tried to ease my pain. Can you imagine that? We're dropping 1 1/4 nuclear bombs on them, and they're caring about me. And Mr. Quat, who had lost everything in the war, a great man who went to midnight mass with me and Joan Baez and was very disappointed. He said he thought it would be much more entertaining and much more exciting than it was. He said, well, I went once, I don't think I'll go again. But Mr. Quat was great, and that was only one reason why I thought he was great. He was Buddhist. And he said, finally, Barry, he said, you've taken all of the pain and the guilt of the war and you've put it on your own shoulders. And now you are just acting and reacting on the basis of guilt and hate. And he said, guilt and hate are destructive emotions, and you can never build anything from guilt and hate. So you've got to stop that. He said the United States government took you and your precious idealism and used it to fight the Vietnamese. It's not your fault. The only thing that matters is that now you stand for peace. And there's no reason for you to have the guilt and the hate. And that, in fact, you have to start working on the basis of love. Love of the Vietnamese people who you are fighting for peace for, and love of the American people who are being used just like you were. And only if you do that are you going to be able to do anything progressive. And I'd stopped crying, and it took me about 10 more years to understand what he was saying. But here was a Vietnamese comforting me while their families were dying. And so I'm going to stop there. I'm going to say a couple of things. If you got any question you want to ask me, believe me, it's already been asked. And so some of you may have relatives, or some of you may want to know about something. Go ahead and ask. Please ask. The other thing is that I drove all the way up here. I work nights. I work at the post office. I'm a Vietnam vet, strike 5. So I'm taking every single minute of your time here. And so if you don't ask me questions, I'm going to start talking. And as you can see, I can talk. So I would rather answer your questions than talk about, mine. Although I do have one more thing I've got to say before I leave, or before most of you leave, hopefully. So if a whole bunch of people are leaving, raise your hand, and I just got some stuff I want to share with all of you. But questions?
Can you just talk about your involvement with the Black Panther Party?
When I came home, there was the Black Panthers were becoming politically active and were getting shot and arrested every place. We worked in support committees, both with people that were going to jail, like I worked on the Soledad Brothers Defense Committee, which was a committee to free George Jackson and a number of other black political prisoners. Also worked with Geronimo Pratt, who was a Vietnam vet, 18 months Vietnam, Silver Star, who was just released from prison after having been framed by the FBI. He was released after 28 years. They hid the fact that the people speaking against him were sheriff's agents for 28 years, and they claimed that they were just normal people who had no say in it. Worked with people like that. Worked against groups like us that were killing Panthers. US was a cultural nationalist group. In Chicago, Daley worked with the Black Peace Donation and with other violent criminal gangs. That's how they actually got their base. Daley had a choice between working with the Panthers in the youth community or working with gangs. And Papa Daley made the choice. And so money went to people that eventually became all the drug lords on the south and west side. Now, it wasn't liberals that did that. That was Daley that did that. So anyway, I did that kind of support stuff. There wasn't a Black Panther chapter in our area. We just worked in terms of prison support. One time the police surrounded the Black Panther headquarters, and the college students emptied off of UCLA and surrounded it. And as a consequence, there was no shootout like there was in Chicago, where they murdered Fred Hampton, because here was a whole bunch of white college students from UCLA that weren't throwing rocks, that weren't doing anything. They just put their bodies there so that the cops couldn't do anything, hidden. Jay stood there and witnessed and saved lots of Panthers' lives. Mostly worked with a black militant named Gary Lawton, who they made a movie about called Hell in the Desert. And who was the head of the Washington Post for Watergate?
Publisher?
Yeah.
Grant?
No, the guy, Bradley.
Ben Bradley.
Ben Bradley's son just graduated from journalist school, and he actually wrote the definitive thing on this trial. He was a black militant who was 35 years old, a Marine, who actually kept riots down because he thought they hurt the black community. And 2 white cops were killed in an ambush slain. And originally they were looking for white hippies in fatigues. And then it shifted to black militants with afros. Gary was bald-headed like me. And Then they changed it a third time, put him on trial. He was found, it was hung jury for 2 trials, and the third jury, the jury found him innocent in less than 1 hour. But he spent 3 years in prison, solitary confinement.
Do you think the United States learned anything from Vietnam? I don't mean like people necessarily, but like the government, and not, I don't mean, do you think they learned anything like we'll have to do it better next time? But do you think they learned any actual lessons that would keep them from doing anything like that again?
The military learned that they've got to keep press under control, and that's what they did. And the entire world, from the Russians in Chechnya to the Chinese and Tibet, have learned, to the United States in the Persian Gulf, have learned how to stifle the press. The only thing is, it can only work on a short war. In a long war, they can't stop it, because quite frankly, people are going to make their names by being journalists in the same way that people are coming out of Chechnya, or the same way people came out of El Salvador with the truth about what was going on in those areas. It'll happen too. So there is an aversion towards any kind of long-term thing. The American public has learned. George Bush, after the Persian Gulf War, said, this has kicked the ass of the Vietnam syndrome. The Americans aren't going to worry about it anymore. What do Americans think about? Do they think about the Iraq War, or do they think about Vietnam? Vietnam is still the number one thing on people's minds. But they didn't learn anything except to lie a little bit more and cheat a little bit more, and that's all.
Just out of curiosity, how did you move to Chicago?
I got elected to the national office of Vietnam Vets Against the War in 1972. And New York, we were talking to someone earlier at the dinner table, New York is probably one of the more expensive places to live. And also the movement in New York is very New York-ish. And it's like New York exists, and then there's the rest of the country. And so we decided that we wanted to move. So I had moved from California to New York City, and then I went down south. I was in the south for 6 months, and or more. And then we moved the national office to Chicago. And then I left the national office. I went back to California to work on Gary Lawton's case, and then I moved back to Chicago. And by the time I was ready to go home, I was divorced with a beautiful daughter, and there was no way I was leaving her. So now I'm in Chicago till forever. And I like Chicago. Chicago's nice. You and then you. Oh, wait. You and then you and then you had your hand up.
Yeah.
No, the girl behind Brooke. Did you have it? No. Yeah, this guy.
Me?
And then, do you have your hand up?
No.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. And then you.
I was just wondering if there was more post-traumatic stress after Vietnam than World War II, and if so, why? Why not as much after World War II?
There's a movie made, The Men, with Marlon Brando, that was actually, even though it was a free movie, it was a public movie, about people with psychological problems, and they actually banned it. I mean, it was like they wouldn't allow it to be seen. It couldn't see the light of day. And the veterans organizations did not support that sort of thing. So the question is, how much of that was hidden? A lot. I was over at Joe's father's house. His father fought at the Battle of the Bulge and was in a unit that was overrun and wiped out. And his father never particularly exhibited over the years PTSD stuff. And I was over their house for his granddaughter's birthday party. And we had another friend who was a medic from Vietnam who had just died, and we were talking about our friend Jack McCloskey. And all of a sudden, his father got a 1,000-yard stare. How old was he, Joe?
At that time, it's probably about 8, 7, 9.
79, and you've never talked before, you get a 1,000-yard stare and started saying, the medics always had it the worst. They always worried. And he was back at the Battle of the Bulge. There is a couple of differences. One, the economy that World War II vets came back to was the best economy of any vet in the history of this country. The GI Bill that they got was 4 times higher than the GI Bill that we got. So they had a good economy, which does make a difference, believe me. They had a war that was popular, they had a war that they won, and they had a war that was just, in my opinion. I'm not a pacifist. When I went to go to Vietnam, my father was 66 years old. He sat me on his lap and he cried, and he said, don't go. And I said to my father, but Dad, you know, Harold, that's my brother, you and him went to the Second World War, and I'm just doing what you did. And he said, no, you don't. He said, I went to fight people that put people in ovens. He said, you're just going to go fight some poor people that are farmers that don't want to be bothered. So I think the nature of the excuse, I mean, you look at Vietnam, what can I say was good about it? What excuse can I make for all the killing that happened? I mean, even if you did a bad thing in the Second World War, you can go, we closed the camps down, if nothing else. There's no way people can look at Vietnam and say, wow, that really did a good thing for somebody. Totally, completely worthless. Just like the Indian Wars. Slaughter, close to genocide. If the U.S. could have, they would have. They just couldn't. So, I don't know. Does that answer your question? Somebody, I'm sorry. I'm not going to remember because my mind's...
I was going to ask, what books or movies do you think are good representations of the Vietnam War?
Good movies. All of Oliver Stone's movies, they've all got a problem. They've all got a problem. The first two got a problem because Oliver Stone is one of the biggest sexist and chauvinists that makes movies, and he belittles women. And when you look at Born on the 4th of July, look at how he shows Ron Kovic's mother, and even if Ron Kovic's mother had a lot of problems, you don't show women how he shows them, and yet he can't get over that. That's his place. But the combat scenes, that demonstration was the Miami Convention in '72 that he has in Born on the 4th of July. The combat scenes in Platoon are great. I remember one of my friends at work who's dead now from Agent Orange, but he was a lieutenant with the 1st Infantry Division. And he came back and he was so disturbed from watching Platoon. And he goes, Barry, we never kept watches on our wrist. There's a scene where at the ambush patrol, Sheen is sweating, and it's on his wrist. And I said, he was cherry, he's fresh in country, and so that his watch was there. We used to wear our watches in our lapels. We would stick the thing in, and that way you could see what time it was, and you didn't sweat through it. And the watches then were not like the ones that they have now. And so he said, no, that's proof that it wasn't real. I said, the other stuff is real. And he couldn't deal with it because he started seeing things that he didn't want to see and had put away in the cupboard. And he came back to me the next day. He said, I looked at my photographs, and you're right. I used to wear my watch the first 2 months on my wrist, and it was only after he learned did it change places. Apocalypse Now is all-time good movie. The Forrest Gump combat scenes are intense. It has other good things and other bad things, but I really like Good Morning Vietnam. First movie to show Vietnamese as human beings, show women who aren't prostitutes. Most importantly, shows a beautiful Vietnamese woman who refuses to fuck the American lead star, white male, which just is unheard of in war movies. And beautiful discussion back and forth about why she can't be his girlfriend. And the end of the movie, where he's chasing down the Viet Cong, and he says, hollers into the slums of Cho Lan, I was your friend, you were the enemy. And the Vietnamese voice comes back, I'm not the enemy, you're the enemy. You came here, you killed my mother, you bombed my village. who are the enemy. And if that doesn't sum up, even with all of the other stuff that's in it. Book, Sand in the Wind, Casualties of War, I'm trying to think of real books. Full Metal Jacket, a lot of them have been made into movies. Sand in the Wind is popular. It's even on the Marine Corps reading list, but it's a very good book. None of the Webb books. I think Jim Webb is really a dishonest individual, and may he die in rotten hell. And I know you didn't have them, but all of the Stallone, except the first Stallone, but the Stallone and the Chuck Norris movies, I hear you had guys that came up with the POW MIA myth, you know, the fact that Americans are still being held in secret camps by those nefarious Asians. We don't know why they're keeping them, because they don't even tell us they're keeping them. And the first thing you do when you're a kidnapper is say, I got him. You know? When they took Patty Hearst, they didn't say, we don't got her. What good does that do? But the Vietnamese have to hold Americans. Why? Because they make such good workers. Right. That's how come we're sending all of our factories over to Vietnam now, is because they want Americans that work for a handful of rice. So, but those guys made movies that kept Vietnam isolated. For 10 years, Vietnam couldn't be recognized because people were running around going, they're holding Americans over there. You have to think about my consciousness. Vietnamese babies born deformed, people stepping on mines and blowing up. And we turned them into the unscrutable. We're the unscrutable. Try to fucking figure that out. Two people who didn't go to Vietnam, Chuck Norris and Stallone, making movies about people not being kept behind. I mean, by people who weren't kept behind, because when every single POW came home, including the guy who just ran for president on the Free Thought Express, or the whatever the fuck he was. Not one of them knew of one American that was left behind. So you have 550 people come back, and they say, all these people died, and these are people we saw that were dead. And the U.S. government says, well, we can't confirm that. The Vietnamese have to confirm that. Well, how are the Vietnamese going to confirm that? Long story. So anyway, I hate all those people, and they deserve a special place in my hell, where I'm going to put them. And then Ronald Reagan watches these movies and thinks they're real, and so supports this guy named the right-wing militia guy, Bo Greitz, this special forces colonel. You know, it's got all the intellect of a large hog in a trough, and supposedly, the Magnum Force.
Clint Eastwood.
Clint Eastwood funds this guy to go over there, and Clint Eastwood is on the phone with fucking Bo Greitz in Bangkok, because they're going to go into Laos, and they're going to find some bodies or some bones. And Reagan's waiting for the call, because the minute they got a confirmed bone, he's going to go on the air and go, if you don't give us the rest of our bones back, or bodies, or whatever, or the people we've got in the deep, dark mine, where they're working as miners, right? You got to understand, 90% of the MIAs were pilots, white pilots, college graduates, not miners. So they're all waiting for this. Bo Greitz gets his group together. They charge across the river and get ambushed. They almost all get killed. They do buy a box of bones. They come back, and the bones are pig bones. And so Clint Eastwood did not call Reagan, and Reagan doesn't remember that either.
You had mentioned numerous times about how your faith in the Roman Catholic religion faded. I was just wondering, what did you base your faith on while you were in Vietnam, that about the end of the war,
No,
Okay.
it's my fault, it's not yours, go ahead.
If you didn't believe in the Roman Catholic faith, what
After Vietnam.
Oh, that was after.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, I took general absolution like any fanatic would. In Vietnam, at that time, in Catholicism, one of the most important sacraments was confession. And I took that to heart in the question of examination of conscience. And the fact that you had to think about what you did wrong and go in, bless me, Father, for I've sinned. It's been so many months since my last confession. And, you know, I've had sex with large critters 4 times. You know, I haven't said my night prayers for a while. I lied to my mom about, you know, drinking. You know, but the thing was you had to examine your conscience and you had to make something to say. I ain't going to do that again. Right? And I really liked that. And in Vietnam, they didn't have confession. They came out and they gave you general absolution. Just like we always make fun of the Muslims. Oh, if they die in battle, they'll go to heaven. The Catholic Church did the equivalent in Vietnam. Don't like to talk about it, did it? So we would go out and we would all get absolved. We wouldn't have to say anything bad that we were doing. And then we would get Holy Communion, and then we would kill people some more. I didn't think about the faith not working. I got real mad because my nephew was religious, and my sister-in-law had a mental breakdown while he was in Vietnam. And we tried to get the Catholic chaplain and the Red Cross to help him get out of Vietnam, or at least into a non-combat job, and they wouldn't do anything. Every single enlisted man, every single sergeant and 1 lieutenant in his company signed a letter to the commanding general at Fort Lewis before he was sent to Vietnam, saying that my nephew was so slow that if he went into combat, he would die. They didn't ask not to be sent themselves. They asked that my nephew not be sent. So, I mean, there was a lot of things that were choking on me when I got back. But believe me, you can't think you're out on search and destroy missions. You don't deep think that way. Oh, I'm sorry, no.
What would you say about the results of Vietnam in the Cold War context and about proxy wars in general?
Well, first off, the Cold War was based upon an entirely incorrect concept that everything was controlled by Moscow. The very first American patch in Vietnam actually had, for Vietnam servicemen, the Great Wall of China on it, with a white sword going up through the center and blocking the Great Wall of China because they thought the Vietnamese were puppets of Mao. Now, the Vietnamese had fought the Chinese for 1,800 years. They were more afraid of the Chinese than they were the Americans. They were trying to make a deal, and yet everybody was a puppet of somebody else, and so that wasn't there to begin with. The question of proxy wars was really much more the United States than it was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union supported real indigenous groups. They might have been fucked up, but they were real. The United States created the groups. The Soviet Union didn't come up with Castro. Castro came up with Castro. The Soviet Union didn't come up with Ho Chi Minh. Uncle Ho was Uncle Ho. You know what I mean? Mao wasn't some figment of Stalin's imagination. He came out of a process in his own country. And so we look for stuff. And in Korea, I mean, most of the documents now, it makes it look like Kim Il-sung wagged the Soviet Union and China. China didn't know what was going on. All of a sudden they woke up to a war that they then had to support. So it's not always, I don't know in terms of proxy wars, I don't like it. The U.S. fought proxy wars. And some of the people we supported, from the Contras in Nicaragua to Pol Pot, a mass murderer, if ever there was one. 10 years we voted that Pol Pot's representative was the true representative of the Cambodian people in the UN every year. Worked in conjunction with China to give money to bleed Vietnam white. So I don't know if that answers your question, but my feeling, and it probably is maybe right. Anybody who hasn't asked a question first?
Can
Are you gonna ask? No.
Me?
You too? No, you be second and then, go ahead. No, the guy first is hard. I'm sorry.
Can you talk some more about post-traumatic stress disorder and the effects that the war had on veterans' lives?
Vietnam was a small unit war, and most combat was centered around small units where people knew each other and had unit cohesion. It was based upon not thousands and millions of people landing on beaches at Normandy, even though there was a large backup tail that kept it going. And so the nature of the unit was intense, familiar, as in family relationships. I tell people I was better friends with the people in my unit in Vietnam than with my family, my brothers, my sisters, and there's no doubt about it. And we were only together for a year. And people had to be able to trust each other if you were going to survive. And I saw black people die for whites, and I saw whites from Mississippi die for blacks, and I saw people putting themselves on their line not to stop communism and not to make Lyndon Johnson happy, or the colonel or the general, but because of the guy that was right next to them that they loved. So you start taking casualties, it's like watching your family being shot away. So you've got that going on. You then have the goodness of most of the American troops, which was, we didn't go to Vietnam because we wanted to act like fascists. We didn't go to Vietnam because we wanted to be like the SS on the Eastern Front. We went to Vietnam for stupid reasons like me, thinking I was going to fight for my Catholic brothers and sisters, and when we got there, we're slaughtering civilians. But what do you do about it? You're 19, you're out in the field, you can't run home, you've got no access to any kind of lever of power. You do one thing wrong, you go to LBJ, Long Binh Jail. And jail in Vietnam had to be worse than combat, so think about how bad the jail was. Because otherwise, shit, I'd go to Club Fed, along with all the Watergate criminals, rather than the Tet Offensive of '68, put me in jail. Long Binh and those jails were concentration camps. And when you got out of jail, all that time was bad. I had a man who shot himself in the foot, went to LBJ for 4 months, he came back and they made him come back to the same unit, my platoon, and he was killed during the Tet. So the other thing is that you don't have time to stop and rationalize. You don't have time after going through an intense psychological point where I can deal with this, because actually Vietnam for me was 365 days times 2. The daylight hours were one segment of my life, and when we pulled into night ambush, whatever happened during the day, I put behind me. I didn't think about people who had been wounded. I didn't think about people I had killed. I just thought about how I was going to get through that night and how my men were going to get through that night. And whatever happened that night, when we started walking the next day, was all I cared about. So I had these 12-hour increments, and no matter what happened in those, I wouldn't think about them. I wouldn't dwell on them. I would put them away. It meant acting normal in an abnormal situation. So now you come home. You've got the guilt of the things that you did wrong. Why'd I say we didn't make good fascists? Germans that slaughtered Jews and commies and Ukrainians didn't feel bad. They felt bad about their friends dying, but they didn't feel bad about the people that they slaughtered because of that racism and because of that fascism. Americans came back and started thinking and relating to the Vietnamese as human beings, which meant I shot a kid. I shot a kid. And now you've got your segments that come rushing back at you. One of the first things that slapped me in the face was, I go to Vietnam, I'm running around jungles, 24 hours later, After a year in the field, I'm back in San Francisco eating a hamburger and drinking a chocolate shake, and I'm still too young to drink a beer. And I have my nephew's body in a casket. So you keep acting normal. But there comes a point where it all comes crashing down. Sometimes it comes crashing down because you have another death in your family or your child dies. I talked to a cop out in the suburbs, and after the Welcome Home Parade 12 years ago, he was a Marine, and he met a whole bunch of other buddies, and they started talking, and they talked about the fact that they had laid mines in Vietnam, and he looked in his child's face, and he saw a Vietnamese child that he had killed 20 years before that. And every time he saw his own child, he started seeing the Vietnamese child in the face. He had to go back to Vietnam and dig up mines that he had left there from 20 years to make up for it. So now you're in that situation. Now if you're isolated from your family because of drugs and alcohol, if you're not close to access to psychiatric help like most working class people are not, you have all of that stuff that comes into play. You don't want to get close to people again? Why? I got fucked before. Why do people get mad at people that get killed in the war?
My question is, if you're a pacifist, or not a pacifist, I mean, what would your opinion be for the U.S. intervening in, like, foreign policy-wise in, like, Africa and stuff, with the genocides and stuff like that?
If the United States had put troops, if the United States had put troops in Rwanda, I would have supported it. And I don't care what reason they did it, because the fact of that genocide was so great and so horrible that that was a reason. And I did support the war in Kosovo. Why did I support that? I didn't support the Persian Gulf. I didn't support any other thing. I supported that because Milosevic and the fascist Serb military had attempted genocide in Bosnia. They were responsible for the rapes of over 30,000 women. 5,000 women were forced to have babies. Kept in camps just so that they would have to give birth. They killed 30 to 50,000 people at Srebrenica, an area where UN troops from Holland, or the Dutch troops, get PTSD because they were taken prisoner. They took all the UN troops prisoner, and then they slaughtered the Bosnian Muslims. We saw how they acted there, and they were getting ready to do the same, except better in Kosovo. And we saw on the news media 120,000 and then 200,000 people uprooted. And if the bombing hadn't started, those people would have been killed exactly like it happened in Bosnia. Those women would have got raped exactly as it happened. And so you have to weigh the good of that. Now, I don't support anything else. I don't support war for oil. But when it reaches the level of genocide, there has to be a point of saying that it's good. I tell this story. My teeth are knocked out by cops. I'm in pain a lot of the time. So if any of you are becoming dentists, this is what you can do for your goodness. Fix my teeth. My daughter knows I'm politically active. Man tried to threaten her and assault her and her friends because they were talking Negro. It was one of his complaints. It's yuppie at Oz Park in Chicago, and was threatening them, being aggressive sexually. She called the cops. Wait a minute, you're calling the cops to kick the shit out of your father. It's a contradiction, but you do what you got to do in a tight situation. That doesn't mean she doesn't know that the cops kicked the shit out of me. Or at another occasion, when she was with a bunch of her friends who were playing basketball, and most of them were minority males, that the cops rousted all of them. She knows what that contradiction, but in order for her to get out of that situation, the cops were better than the alternative. Does that help? Right. Okay. I'm not easy with violence. I think violence is a horrible thing. I think violence takes away from the person even when it's on a good side. There's a book written by a Vietnamese soldier, The Sorrow of War. Please read it. Here's a guy that was on a good side. Here's a guy who fought 7 years. It's got everything you could want: sex, blood, violence, and the Vietnamese side. And certainly,
Just want to point out, apparently there's something else coming in this room at 9 o'clock.
Mhm.
So,
Can I, if I can just finish this real quickly. See, we keep talking about the past, and you know, I'm a '60s hippie with no hair, with a nice beard and wear glasses now. But struggle doesn't stop. I mean, my father fought fascists, and a lot of people say, "Oh, I would fight fascists, but we don't have any." But you know what? If you don't do it when it's easy, you don't do it when it's hard. If you can't walk in a valley, you can't climb a mountain. We're all faced with contradictions, with inequities, with problems, with immorality, with oppression. And how we respond to that within our time is the reality of what kind of heroes we are. When I first became political, I was always pissed that I couldn't be organizing the great steel strike. Every generation always looks back to a generation and says, "God damn, that looked like fun." But I think I did a good job in terms of civil rights. I think I learned a lot of stuff. I think I did a good work in terms of anti-war activity. And I think that I met the challenge that was there to face me. You got people in this room that are the same age as you, that are politically involved, that are fighting the good fight, that are putting themselves on the line, that are taking their own lives and saying, "I want to have some control over it." Because your control comes from the fact when you decide to do right, separated from whether you're going to go to heaven or jail. Old man Rockefeller, richest man in the world, had everything. So afraid of death that he had 2 black wet nurses, 2 women that he had to have wet nurses at the end, suckling like a baby because he so feared death. All the money in the world couldn't give him a good conscience or make his life of value. So he sat on his front porch, trying to keep every second of life inside of him. Rosa Parks refused to move in a bus, was willing to go to jail for bus drivers that carried guns, and to help organize and lead a movement that changed America. Rosa Parks moves to Detroit, is beat by young African American males on her front porch, people that she had fought for their freedom. Rosa Parks doesn't move out of the ghetto. Rosa Parks continues to embrace her community and rock back and forth unafraid on her front porch. We're all able to make something with our own life. Rosa Parks was braver than any general in Vietnam, and you don't have to be a male with a uniform in order to inspire people or put yourself on the line. I mean, Tara, what were you doing last Friday?
Marching.
And
Rallying, marching, we're going to take back the night on Friday.
why?
Well, it was a march against sexual violence and sexism. We had about 300 to 400 women marching with us. A lot of the women here were in buffs.
And what were some of the things that educated males were saying? The bad thing.
We're saying?
Saying.
We were sluts, we were lesbians, we were bitches. They took swings at us.
Said rape was good for you?
They didn't say that, actually.
Oh, that not this year?
Oh, there were a couple of males that were yelling in favor of violence at the rally. Said, "Yeah, yay, violence."
What were you doing last week and the week before, Brooke?
Last week and the week before,
a month ago we were sitting in
Oh, was that a month?
administration building. Time passes fast. Graduate employees on campus trying to unionize took over an administration building and made 20 hours for the university administration to come and talk to them about conditions of their employment. Finally marched out, calling for removing their labor if they don't get to talk with their employers about their labor. Support your TAs.
See, when I was 19, I was leading people in Vietnam to kill people, and there are people here that when they were 19 are leading women to be safe and secure in their own body and person on a college campus where people are supposed to be educated, and where women are leading a struggle for people to be recognized as a union and just have the right to bargain. And that's going on around you, and you should be connected with stuff like that. And when people come and listen to me and hear about what it was like to get the shit kicked out of me by the cops or the Nazis, or except the Nazis kicked their asses back. But you've got to know that the struggle is now and the struggle is here. If it wasn't for the anti-war movement, Richard Nixon said he would have used nuclear weapons in Vietnam. He said there was two things that stopped him: worldwide protest and the protest that would have occurred at home. If he'd only had one of those, he would have used nuclear weapons rather than lose the war. If I did nothing else with my entire life in the anti-war movement and VVAW and Dave Dillinger and everybody else that was around, the only thing that we accomplished was that nuclear weapons not be used. That was enough for the entire movement and all the deaths and arrests and everything else that came through. We accomplished a lot more than that. So hopefully you're going to stand with Rosa Parks. Hopefully you're going to stand with Brooke and with Tara. Hopefully you're going to realize that you live in a country where you have the right to have freedoms that other people die for, and that your tax dollars go to repress. And that means you've got a responsibility. When you wear Nike, you got to make sure that Nike workers get paid decent wages. So that's all I've got. The only thing is, there's some newspapers, and they cost 50 cents. They're free.
Martin, can I make a quick announcement? Next Thursday in this room at 7:30, Bill Davis from Vietnam Veterans Against the War, former national coordinator of VVAW, and Brooke Anderson right here are going to be doing a talk on student activism after Kent and Jackson State. It's titled 30 Years Lessons from Kent and Jackson State for Struggles of Today. We encourage it to be a great event. We'll have a couple speakers and just be talking about activism and talking about sort of what happened 30 years ago coming up, and also we'll also be talking about 25 years at the end of the Vietnam War. So anybody who can come, please do.